My name is Abby Broughton, and my case is entitled Knowing Dangerously an Immoral Education, and immoral, the I am in parentheses. So the increase in reading for pleasure in the 18th century came not without consequence. As reading became more central in its intimacy, it caused some authors and editors to question the value of books and their role in educating individuals in an ever-changing society. Books in the 18th century were the technology of the day, and that they were the leading medium of transmitting knowledge. As this technology became readily available to a wider public, knowledge was accessible to nearly everyone, thus leading the information transmitted to become less and less controllable. Consider the difference between group learning, such as participating in a salon, or for children, sitting in on group lessons with a private tutor, with sitting alone with a text and interpreting the message by yourself as you read. This transformation during the Enlightenment is astonishing. Education entered into the private sphere the moment individuals began reading books alone. This meant that individuals were now given the capacity to make independent judgments, and this was potentially quite frightening. This fear ties into the idea of danger. Danger in reading, danger in being given information people might not have been equipped to handle, the way leading philosophers, religious officials, or others would have liked. In this presentation, and in my case, which is this one over here, I aim to explore the relationship between danger and pleasure as it applies to reading in 18th century France. And the questions I'm most interested in are danger and pleasure intrinsically opposed? And furthermore, is pleasure personal, or is it political and social as well? To start, I begin with the preface, called an avertissement in French. While this does literally translate to a foreword or a preface, it also can translate to warning or caution. The books selected here both warn of immorality and tempt their readers to explore the provocative discourses within. They play with forms of language that touch readers' sensibilities, thus provoking unexpected ways of judging societal education. Reading in the 18th century was seen as a gateway for interaction in the real world. Yet when reading novels such as Rousseau's Julie or The New Heloise set readers off into a frenzy, the sensible message was obscured and thus rendered potentially dangerous. Reading, as we have already discussed today, was indeed a physical experience, yet it also changed the mind. Take Montesquieu, for example, who described this phenomenon in relationship to the economy of a social environment, wherein education occurs at multiple stages and links into different parts of the body. For Montesquieu, therefore, ideas were just as physical as humors, or the bodily fluids, and education truly had a physical impact on the human experience. In the 18th century, education was not strictly defined. It was thought that knowledge gleaned from books could produce other forms of interactions or actions in the world. The text could physically change the reader's way of thinking, or the esprit, hence why it was even more crucial that the book's contents leave readers with sound moral knowledge that they could thus take into the world. Object 3 in my case is the book Innocent Impostures, or M's Opuscules, and has all the stars, the preface of which contains a copy of Mademoiselle de Guarany's musings on Montaigne's essays. Mademoiselle de Guarany, a contemporary of Montaigne, so in the 16th century, would obviously not have read Innocent Impostures. The preface seems almost copied and pasted into the book with no obvious link to the actual novel. Yet its addition in the preface attempts to elevate Innocent Impostures to the level of a work that is worthy of being studied. And even though Mademoiselle de Guarany was writing 2 centuries earlier, her words truly set the theme for my studies. She writes, and I quote, "It is not the candid and speculative discourses on love that are dangerous. It is the soft and delicate ones, the artistic and sensitive stores of romantic passions, and of their effects that are visible to novels and poets. Dangerous, I say, still, but that would be much less without the increase and the high price where the laws of the ceremony and their exemptions raise Cupid and Venus. Nevertheless, I admittedly have a great fear that humankind cannot know more dangerously which animal is love when nobody tells him or her." End quote. Thus, my question: if education is essential to producing a moral person, how can one know dangerously? It is my opinion that in including Mademoiselle de Gouragny's note, the editor of Innocent Impostures offers the public a chance to experience the immoral, or the questionably moral, in fiction in hopes that readers will ruminate on his or her own moral path in the real world. And this idea is slightly at odds with the central figure of my case, Jean-Jacques Russo. Both during his life and after his death in 1778, Rousseau's works were read in ways he never would have imagined. And that would be the top book that is at the top of my pyramid. So his epistolary novel, Julie, or The New Heloise, lies at the heart of the Rousseauian frenzy, and my case. It's object number 8. Published in 1761, the novel's original edition was subtitled Letters from Two Lovers Living in a Small Town at the Foot of the Alps. And what created the frenzy was that the novel was well known to be fiction, but Rousseau presented it as actual letters exchanged between a group of young people that he simply collected and published. And this act of intentional editorial misguidance was widespread throughout the epistolary genre. The readers of these novels engage in a game with the author that allows them to enter into a realm of suspended reality, accepting the lie and embracing the fiction as truth. In Rousseau's preface, or one of his many prefaces to Julie, he writes, I quote, "Although I am only bearing the title of editor here, I worked myself on this book, and I don't hide the fact. Did I do all of it, and is the entire correspondence fiction? People of the world, what does it matter? It's surely a fiction for you." And later he writes, I quote, "This book is not made to be circulated throughout the world and will suit few readers. Who will thus enjoy it? Perhaps me alone, but without fail, it will appeal mediocrely to no one." End quote. And unlike this assumption on his own work, however, the novel was a smashing success, read by all as if it were a soap opera. Though the letters transferred between Julie, Claire, Saint-Preux, and others, or through the letters, Rousseau explores the line between doing what is expected by society and what is authentic to one's own identity. Julie's and Claire's eventual deaths, and Saint-Preux's solitary despair at the end, may be viewed as results of personal inauthenticity faced with societal mores. Like many of Rousseau's other works, notably Émile or On Education, Julie was meant to instruct as it entertained, allowing readers' sensibilities to be stimulated in a variety of ways. This plays into the philosopher's thoughts on educating the whole person, yet delves more deeply into the ideas of authentic morals and what it means to be ethical. The education found in Julie can be interpreted multiple ways, meaning its reception was out of Rousseau's hands the minute the novel was published and distributed. The passion Julie inspired in her readers led me to think about what it means to know, and how more and more knowing in the 18th century was a sensual or emotional experience of the world, not exclusively the possession of facts or the ability to reason. However, the alarming rate at which Julie's popularity grew leads me to ask the question, did the plot overshadow the lesson? Which then leads us back to our original question, the idea of the danger of reading. If reading is meant to instruct, what happens when the reader falls into the delirium of pure pleasure? In the epistolary novel, Saint-Preux writes to Julie's friend Claire about a nightmare he has in which Julie dies. In this dream, he is devastated to the point of despair, aching to clutch at her cold tomb. Yet Julie, the ever-constant voice of reason, appears and calms him, and his fears vanish. And we can well deduce that Rousseau is implying that Saint-Preux's fear, his ghost, is not the result of external sources. It is within himself, and he must conquer his own personal struggle in order to progress throughout life. Yet is the moral lesson clear underneath such a juicy plot on forbidden romance and death? Rousseau's contemporary, the well-known German intellectual and pastor Johann Formy, would argue that the moral message was completely lost. Taking matters into his own hands, Formy attempted to rewrite Julie or the New Heloise in hopes of proposing a more robust example of moral education. In 1763, so 2 years after the release of Julie, Formy published Julie's Spirit, or Excerpt of the New Heloise. This is object 7. Now, with such a title, one would imagine a Reader's Digest version of the novel, something that has been reduced in length, but where the words, the plot, etc. are essentially the same. And in fact, Julie's spirit is absolutely nothing like the New Eloise. Formy reduces the epistolary novel to a work of moral statements, completely vanishing the plot. In his preface, he writes of the original novel's danger, and I quote, "Its author, Russo, is unquestionably one of the most skillful writers of this century. I would not as affirmatively decide that he is one of the best. Everything is an issue in his eyes, and he wants to render everything problematic to his readers. His works then become more dangerous than those of writers sworn by irreligion." End quote. Formy's version of Julie proposes a work that is useful to society, especially to youth, as stated in the book's subtitle. In this heavily modified version of Rousseau's original, Formy takes it upon himself to include only what he deems appropriate, rendering the multi-tome epistolary novel to a reductive list of maxims, which include, I quote, "It is a very dangerous situation for young women who are too educated to allow themselves to be governed by others and are not enough to govern themselves. And simple girls can be honest, but they are less so than those who are because they want to be." End quote. Formy's rewrite treats education completely differently than Rousseau, who allowed, and perhaps intentionally, perhaps unintentionally, the reader to interpret the message implicitly through the plot and the emotion it transmits. Formy's maxims are reminiscent of the Fragonard engraving seen here in Objects 1 and 2 on the back, which are entitled with easily manipulated reductive messages such as "education makes everything." In comparing these maxims to Rousseau's immensely popular text, Formy's work lacks Julie's sentimental qualities that captivated the reader's attentions, leaving us to question which form of educational literature was in fact more effective. So how did readers in the 1700s navigate the endlessly contradictory nature of Enlightenment literature? In a time where education, or schools, were not yet standardized, the reader was left to fend for his or herself, thus strengthening the personal reasoning in the face of innumerable scholars, philosophers, and religious figures that attempted to do all of the reasoning for everybody. It is in this intimacy between the reader and the book where 18th century society was given the opportunity to explore the world on their own terms, with their bodies and with their minds, through the sensual pages of the book in their hands. Thank you.